Italian tailoring died between 1985 and 2008. The master tailors who built the finest suits ever made are mostly retired or dead. Their successors make suits in factories now owned by Kering, the French luxury conglomerate that also controls a crocodile skin supplier in France, a perfume house, and several brands that have nothing to do with tailoring. The fabric still says "Made in Italy." The label still says Brioni. But the thing that made those words mean something, the unbroken chain of human knowledge running from a workshop in Rome back through the 1950s, the hands that knew how a full canvas should float against a chest, how a spalla camicia shoulder should sit without a trace of padding, that chain is already broken. What you see on a rack today is not what your father would have seen. It is a very expensive approximation of a thing that no longer exists. This is the story of how the greatest suit-making tradition in history quietly stopped being the greatest, and why almost nobody said anything. At the peak of Italian tailoring, three houses defined what a serious suit meant to the world. Brioni was founded in Rome in 1945 by a master tailor named Nazareno Fontecoli and an entrepreneur named Gaetano Savini. In 1952, they staged the first men's fashion show in the modern history of fashion at the Sala Bianca inside the Palazzo Pitti in Florence, decades before runway shows for men were considered normal. Clark Gable, John Wayne, and Cary Grant wore Brioni through the 1950s. In 1959, the house opened a production facility in Penne, a small town in the Abruzzo Mountains, building what they called the Brioni Roman style, a factory unlike anything else in luxury menswear, combining industrial scale with hand-tailored production. The jackets were built on a full floating canvas, a construction method that requires a craftsman to pad stitch the chest piece by hand, stitch by stitch, so that the jacket moves with the body rather than against it. This is what separated a Brioni from a fused suit off any other rack, and it is not something a machine can replicate. Then in 1985, they opened a dedicated tailoring school in Penne, designed to pass the specific Brioni sartorial method to the generation that would follow. That school was not a marketing exercise. It was the acknowledgement that what they were making was too complex, too embodied, too human to survive without active transmission. From 1995 to 2006, Pierce Brosnan wore Brioni suits as James Bond. Across 4 films, GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, and Casino Royale, Brioni dressed the most recognizable fictional man in cinema. The costume designer Lindy Hemming chose Brioni because they offered something no Savile Row house could match: the craftsmanship of a great bespoke tailor combined with the production capacity to build dozens of identical suits for action sequences and stunt doubles. On Savile Row, a bespoke commission might require 50 hours of handwork and months of fittings. The standard is extraordinary, but the scale is not. Brioni could do both. Every man who watched those films understood without being told what that silhouette meant. It meant authority. It meant the highest possible standard. It meant Italy. Kiton was built on a different kind of ambition. Founded in 1968 in Arzano, just outside Naples, by a man named Ciro Pione, Kiton turned obsession into a business model. Each suit required 25 hours of handwork and more than 1,500 individual steps. The lapels were hand-rolled, a technique that requires a craftsman to curl and stitch the lapel so it breaks naturally rather than lying flat like a pressed crease, and finished with pick stitching visible along the edges, the kind of detail that only a practiced eye catches from a distance, but that the wearer feels every time he moves. The buttonholes were stitched by craftsmen who had spent years mastering that single technique. Working buttonholes, surgeon's cuffs in the trade are one of the clearest markers of genuine hand tailoring because they require the sleeve to be attached last after the buttonholes are cut. A fused suit cannot do this. In the Arzano atelier, 350 tailors worked in specialized groups, one circle of artisans for the shoulders, another for the collar, each an expert in a specific stage rather than the whole garment. The cloth itself came from the finest northern Italian mills, Loro Piana and Biella, whose Super 150s and Super 180s wools are the benchmark against which every other luxury suiting fabric in the world is measured. At the extreme end of the range sat the K50, built exclusively by one of Kiton's 5 most senior master tailors, over 50 hours of concentrated work, priced at $60,000. In the world of fine tailoring, Kiton was the argument that ended every argument. Zegna was the oldest. Ermenegildo Zegna founded his wool mill in Trevero, in the Italian Alps, in 1910. Over the following century, the family built something genuinely unique in luxury manufacturing, a vertically integrated empire that controlled the entire chain, from wool grown on the company's own farms, including properties in Australia's finest growing regions, to the finished fabric woven in Biella, to the finished garment sold in their own stores. When you wore a Zegna, every single component had been touched by the same family's hands. That was not theater, it was structural quality, built into the architecture of the company itself. These 3 houses, alongside a handful of independent Neapolitan ateliers, Cesare Ottolini, whose house had been making coats for Neapolitan nobility since the 1930s, and Rubinacci, where Gennaro Rubinacci had essentially invented the concept of the soft Neapolitan shoulder in the 1920s, represented the most complete tailoring culture ever assembled in a single country. In Rome and Milan, houses like Caracini had spent decades building their own distinct regional traditions. The Roman houses favored a slightly more structured line, while the Milanese split the difference between Italian softness and Northern European precision. And below these rarefied peaks, houses like Canali and Corneliani represented a broader tier of serious Italian craftsmanship, not bespoke but rigorously made, and honest about what they were. Together they formed an ecosystem, and then quietly, piece by piece, it began to unravel. The 2008 financial crisis did not destroy Italian tailoring outright. It did something more corrosive. It shifted what luxury spending was allowed to mean. The men who had bought a Brioni suit as the expected uniform of boardroom authority began to wonder whether that authority needed displaying in quite the same way. The informal revolution that Silicon Valley had spent a decade pushing, with the hoodie as a power symbol and the untucked shirt as a creative credential, suddenly had cultural momentum behind it. Formal dressing started its long, quiet retreat from daily professional life. For a house like Brioni, this was not a minor inconvenience, it was a structural threat. Their customer was a specific kind of man, one who wore a suit to work every day, who understood the difference between a floating canvas and a fused chest, who could feel the difference a Brioni jacket made in the way it moved. As that customer base aged and thinned without a younger generation to replace it, Brioni was left searching for a new identity while holding a product that required exactly the customer it was losing. In November 2011, Kering, the French luxury conglomerate then still operating as PPR, which would rename itself Kering in 2013, announced the acquisition of Brioni from the founding Savini and Fontecoli families for an estimated €350 million. The family era ended. The house that Nazareno Fontecoli had built by hand in Rome in 1945 now belonged to the same group that owned Gucci and Balenciaga, and a stake in a company that tanned crocodile skins in France. Kering wanted what every conglomerate wants from a heritage acquisition: growth, relevance, and margin. Brioni could offer none of those things easily. It was a slow, technical, deeply specialized trade, not a handbag brand that could open stores in Shanghai and triple its revenue. The years that followed were the story of that gap between what the house was and what its new owners needed it to become. By 2015, Brioni's revenues had fallen by €20 million. Wholesale was contracting, and the brand had cycled through creative directors without finding a direction. Then in March 2016, Kering made a move that told you exactly how lost they were. They appointed Justin O'Shea as creative director. O'Shea was Australian, heavily tattooed, with no formal design training whatsoever. He had been the global fashion director of a German e-commerce website. His first advertising campaign for Brioni starred Metallica, the heavy metal band, dressed in Brioni tuxedos. 6 months later, he was fired while traveling in Paris. Brioni announced that the following season's collection would not appear on a runway. It would be shown privately in a Milan showroom. An industry analyst noted that Brioni represented 1.5% to 2% of Kering's total revenues. 1.5%. The most prestigious menswear house in Rome had become a rounding error in a Parisian quarterly report. 4 creative directors in 7 years, a brand without a home inside the company that owned it. Zegna's story moved on a different timeline but arrived at the same essential place. In December 2021, the Ermenegildo Zegna Group went public on the New York Stock Exchange, becoming the first Italian fashion company ever listed in New York at a valuation of over $3 billion. The family retained just over 60% of the shares. But a company listed on the New York Stock Exchange does not answer only to its founding family. It answers to analysts, to institutional shareholders, to a market that measures the worth of tailoring heritage against a quarterly earnings call. The acquisitions reflected the pressure. In 2018, Zegna purchased an 85% stake in Thom Browne for $500 million. Thom Browne is defined by irony, with deliberately shrunken jackets, ankle-bearing trousers, and American prep worn a size too small as a kind of high-fashion joke. It is interesting, provocative work. It is also the direct philosophical opposite of everything Zegna had spent a century building. In 2023, Zegna acquired Tom Ford Fashion. By 2022, the company had moved its legal headquarters to the Netherlands. In 2025, Zegna Group revenues fell. Thom Browne contracted nearly 15%. Tom Ford Fashion reported a negative operating result of close to 20 million euros in the first half of the year. The company that once controlled its wool from the sheep to the finished thread, that sourced Super 150s and Super 180s from its own Biella operations, that set the standard every other mill in the world measured itself against, was now managing a portfolio of loss-making acquisitions in a structure legally registered in a country that has no tailoring tradition at all. And beneath all of that, something harder to quantify was happening. The craft itself was leaving. A writer documenting Florentine tailoring noted in early 2026 that many of the city's finest masters had died without a next generation because the old Italian way was not to teach openly. Some would leave the room while attaching a sleeve so their apprentices could not observe. The knowledge was not in any manual. It lived in hands, and when those hands stopped working, the knowledge stopped with them. In Naples, the same pattern was emerging, ateliers struggling to find young workers willing to commit the years the work demands. In the United States, the Bureau of Labor Statistics had estimated a 30% decline in the number of professional tailors over the preceding decade. The median age of those still working had reached 54, 12 years above the average for the overall workforce. Kiton had seen this coming. In 2000, the house launched a school of advanced tailoring in Arzano, offering a 3-year program for students between 16 and 21. Around 80% of graduates joined the tailoring industry directly. Today, Kiton remains family-owned under Ciro Paione's nephew Antonio De Matteis, still runs 350 tailors in Naples, still demands 25 hours of handwork per jacket, still sources its finest cloths from Loro Piana and the great Biella mills, still cuts its lapels by hand and finishes its buttonholes by individual craftsmen who have spent years learning that one thing. It is a deliberate act of preservation in an industry that has otherwise stopped preserving. Kiton is the exception. And exceptions prove rules. When Pierce Brosnan wore a Brioni suit in Goldeneye in 1995, the tailor who cut his jacket had trained for years under craftsmen who had started work before the Second World War. The knowledge that produced that suit was the accumulated experience of 3 generations, passed person to person across 5 decades. That chain broke sometime around 2011, not with a press release, not with a ceremony. It broke the way most important things break, quietly and without anyone stopping to acknowledge that this particular moment was the last one. Today you can still buy a Brioni suit. It will cost between $5,000 and $10,000. It will be a well-constructed garment by any objective measure. But the tailors who built the suits Pierce Brosnan wore in Paris, some are retired, some are gone. The specific knowledge of how a Brioni Roman shoulder should sit, of how the full canvas of that house should float against the chest, of what 40 years of making one style of jacket feels like in the hands, that knowledge was never written down. It left with the people who held it. The labels still say what they always said. The suits still look like what they always were. But the thing that made those names carry weight, that thing already happened. It was made. It was worn by men who understood exactly what they were wearing. And then, without fanfare, it quietly stopped. Some things cannot be recovered by a new management team or a new creative director or a listing on the New York Stock Exchange. Some things can only be inherited, and inheritance requires a chain that has not been broken. That chain is broken.